In January of 1974, Linda Cummings was at the brink of beginning a new life on her own. Her mother had passed away when she was just 5 years old. Her stepfather was an alcoholic and unable to care for her and her siblings. She was raised in the state of Illinois foster care system. But in her mid-teens, she managed to make her way to California in order to reunite with her birth father. After a somewhat rocky start, she graduated from Santa Ana High School. She found a job and was able to support herself. It was just then, when everything seemed to be going her way, a great job, a new apartment, and even enrolling in college, that something suddenly went very wrong. On January 24th, 1974, Linda was discovered hanging in her brand new apartment. She was nude, and even when the police and detectives arrived, something didn't seem right. It would take decades before some semblance of justice would be achieved. But this didn't happen because of the efforts of the police, but because of a persistent reporter who, once having heard about her case, just wouldn't let it go. He had to make sure there was justice for Linda. You see, Larry Welborn, an Orange County newspaper reporter, suspected it was murder by suicide.
Today we welcome former reporter and newly minted crime author Larry Welborn to Behind the Badge.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, Larry, I've said it before, what makes this so interesting is the fact that it wasn't a cop chasing justice for the victim, but a reporter. And Greg just alluded to the fact you've covered hundreds and hundreds of these cases, yet this one particular victim, Linda Cummings, somehow struck you that you felt compelled, driven, whatever, to seek justice for her and her murder because, let's face it, some victims get murdered and because of who they are or what they do, whatever, they get a tremendous amount of attention. Tell us about Linda Cummings and who she was.
Linda was raised in Illinois and she was in the foster care system. I think she had a whole lot of courage when after she aged out of foster care. She got on a Greyhound bus and came across the country to Orange County to try to be reunited with her father, where she went to school at Santa Ana High School, wanted to be a nurse, and all she wanted to do was take care of her younger half brothers and stepsister, and take care of her elderly patients, and hang curtains in her new apartment in Santa Ana. But instead, she came across a sociopath who raped her, staged the scene to make it look like a suicide, and got away with it. And I thought that all the other cases I've covered, there were other law enforcement detectives and prosecutors and other people looking after those people, looking after cases, trying to get justice in those cases. As events unfolded, nobody was going to stand up for Linda, and I thought that I should, as a reporter trying to get to the bottom of her story.
You use her driver's license photograph here on the front of her book, on the front of your book. Why does that photo so strike you that you had to put on the cover of your book?
I got a call when I was working in the register late at night, waiting for my story to clear the editors, and I was bouncing a tennis ball up against the cabinet and catching it, and it was a story that was being edited. And this woman said, my stepdaughter was murdered, and it was murdered by the guy in your story. And until that time, I didn't know Linda Cummings had died. I didn't know she had lived. I didn't know anything about her. And this is 10 months after her death. And I said, what guy in my story? And she said, this guy, this trial I was covering, also killed my Linda. And now I'm thinking, as a young reporter with not a whole lot of experience, the guy in this last trial has not been hooked up to another murder. That's the interesting story. So I said, I'll make a few phone calls, see if I can find out. I think it's going to take a few phone calls to sort this out. It might be a good story. It might make the front page. So it only took me 46 years to get to the bottom of it, and that's the essence of the story. But the first day, for my first step, I wanted to look at her death record to see if this woman was telling me something that is really could be developed into a story. And so I went to the coroner's office, and they gave me this manila envelope. And I opened up the envelope, and there were some documents in there, and this card fell out. I thought it was a credit card. But I look at it, and it's their driver's license with their picture on. The cover is her picture. And you see her stapled to a report. The staple holes right there. And if you look at this carefully, the eyes, wherever you look at it, his eyes follow you around. And I thought that was pretty compelling and kind of stayed in my mind for all this time when I was researching this story, trying to find some degree of justice for Linda. And that's the image on the cover that my daughter actually designed that cover.
When I look at this story, I mean, I've described, how tenacious you were to keep going. It takes nearly 4 decades of talking to police investigators, talking to people from the coroner's office, talking to prosecutors, and going through the court system. And it's like little bits and little bits. It opens up and it closes. It opens up and it closes. But you kept digging and digging and trying to get people interested in this case.
That's true, and I thought about that a lot, and why I kept doing it. And the reason is because I wasn't finished covering the story. I didn't get to some kind of a place where it was fully over. If you think somebody's been murdered, and you're a citizen of our great state, you're kind of obligated to try to find, report it to the authorities, or try to find some way to get that case in front of the court. I never got to that point where I felt I had the case resolved, so I continued on. I was covering a lot of other cases at the time, so it wasn't like I was just covering this case exclusively, but I was working on a lot of other cases. And as things developed, Joe, the police rotated out of there, the detectives rotated out of their detective assignment and retired, and the coroner went to Palm Springs, and there was nobody left. Nobody left to kind of take the mantle of Linda's injustice with him, so it kind of fell to me, and I couldn't let it go.
As you were covering this, it's 1974. Technology isn't what it is today, but things started changing. In fact, the whole concept of cold case units starts taking fruit probably early 90s, I would say. People start looking at some of these cases, and you happen to capture the right people at the right time to really get interested in this case again.
That's an intriguing part. I think that using DNA to solve cold cases might be the biggest improvement in law enforcement techniques since the fingerprinting. But in 1974, there's no such thing as DNA. There's even not even a thought that it's coming down the pike. So. Do you save biological evidence from 1974? Do you save that? Some police departments did, and you see these cases being solved when you find an eyelash or a semen or something from a prior crime case. I felt they should have saved biological evidence in this case in 1974, but they didn't, and that's one of the biggest mysteries of my whole investigation. Why didn't they do that?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was kind of interesting because Louis Wazinski, the guy who commits the murder and ends up getting arrested for it decades.
Wychecki. Yeah.
Louis Wychecki. He commits another murder shortly after he commits this murder, and that's how he ends up in jail.
That's correct. 5 weeks after Linda died of a suicide, allegedly by the coroner's office, because that's what he ruled after the killer stays at the crime scene.
And that was important. The fact that he ruled it a suicide pretty much shut the case down for the detective.
Exactly. Yeah, the detective said, well, what am I going to do? He ruled it suicide, and how am I going to get the DA to file a murder case if the coroner says it's suicide? But 5 weeks later, almost to the day, another woman in the same apartment complex, it's only 25 units, dies of strangulation. I mean, the killer actually called the FBI and said, hey, a woman's been kidnapped from my apartment complex, and they want $500,000 or some money, and he actually produced a ransom note, blocked that on dyno tape. He misspelled 2 words though, and that's what came to his demise. So he's arrested because he misspelled the same 2 words in a spelling test the Santa Ana Police Department gave him that were misspelled on the ransom note, so they arrested him for murder. But now the coroner's office and Santa Ana Police Department have this dilemma. This first case was ruled a suicide, and now they got this other woman strangled in the same apartment, 5 weeks apart. They reopened the first case, Linda Cummings' case, and exhumed the body and did a more thorough autopsy, and they did find semen in her vagina. You'd think they would save that. That's a rape kit, and you'd think they'd save that. But they did not. And that's what kind of doomed this case to kind of rot in an undetermined purgatory for another, 44 years, 46 years.
But you kept after it. You would find somebody that might show an interest. You would find a new DA, a new investigator, somebody that you would keep giving little bits to.
I came back and forth to the courthouse as a reporter 3 different times, and every time I'd see somebody that might be connected, might have a reason to be interested in the case, I'd run this by them, and they'd all be interested in it, but they said, I don't know, I can't do anything about it. What would we do? Nobody could find a way to proceed for 31 years, as it turns out, and I didn't miss the opportunity to bring it up to somebody that might have a chance to do it. Because here was my dilemma. I mean, I thought this guy committed a murder, and I'm a reporter. I can't arrest anybody. I can't service subpoena anybody. I can't demand that they come down the station. I want to talk to you. I did. I flew out to Wisconsin to find the murderer's ex-wife, because there was a court document that said she refused to give information to police on the Linda Cummings case because she was also giving information on the Morgan case. And in her mind, she thought if she gives information on both cases, theoretically the DAs could link them together and charge him with a capital case, a death penalty case for committing multiple murders, more than one murder, first-degree murder, to a death penalty. And while she was divorced, her husband didn't want anything to do with him. She didn't want to have anything to do with the death penalty. But he didn't go down on a murder the first time around. He went down on a voluntary manslaughter. That can't be connected up to a capital case. So I thought maybe she does have information on the Linda Cummings case. So I flew to Wisconsin. I flew to Chicago, rented a car, and drove to Wisconsin and knocked on her door. I didn't think anybody was home at first, and then this enormous woman in a muumuu comes out. What do you want? What are you doing knocking on my door? Smoking a cigarette? And I said, well, I'm from Orange County. I think I want some information on the Linda Cummings case. Do you want to talk about it? Yeah, my ex-husband killed Linda, and I know it. I said, I finally got my story after all this time. It turned out she knew it more or less like I knew it, like putting pieces together, but nothing major she knew. Although she did tell me that on night in question, when Linda died, her husband said he was answering phone calls for the fire department across the street, so they could get to sleep. So for 2 hours on the night Linda died, his whereabouts is unaccounted for. So that's one step I took along the way, and I run it by the DA of Orange County, Tony Rackauckus. I ran it by every homicide prosecutor I could find, trying to find somebody to take up the cause of justice on Linda's behalf.
Mm-hmm. And you eventually did find that person, Larry Yellen, I think.
Yes, Larry Yellen was a new prosecutor on the homicide panel when I came back to the courthouse for the third time. And I heard about him, and I heard that he was a dynamic guy, and he was president of the union. And finally I met him, and he's telling me about this one case he has where they found an eyelash in the evidence locker of a case that was like 20 years old. And they had the eyelash tested, and it came back to a guy in prison for another rape. Because they saved an eyelash. And so I said, well, maybe they could find the rape kit from the first exhumation down in Orange County and Santa Ana. And I ran this story by him, and he immediately said, boy, we got to do something about this. And he didn't look at obstacles or problems, or he just said, we got to do something about it. And he took the challenge and went with it. Very impressive.
Yeah, I spoke with Larry as well, and he said to me that every cop has that one case that just sits with them forever, and he said, but you put all of those cases together, and they don't match what you had. It was, he saw what you went through was something special, something different. And he said, you know, what has happened is not okay. And that's why he became passionate about this case.
And that's why he's one of the best prosecutors in Orange County history. I think he's just, he sees injustice and wants to, he's now a judge in Superior Court. I'm very, very impressed by him, and he, you know, I did cover the dating game killer, Ronnie Alcala, and the William Bonin, the freeway killer, and Randy Kraft, who I think killed 65 people. I covered trials of police killers, child killers, murders for hire. I covered maybe 18 death penalty cases. But this is the one case that stuck with me because all those other cases had people after the killers, and nobody was looking after Linda and trying to find justice for her. So I thought that somebody needs to do that, and so I took that up, and that's where I ended up where I did.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad to say, but sometimes you have high value, low value victims. This young lady had really no one championing her, pushing investigators or anything like that. If you hadn't picked this up, it probably would have just, I know for certain, it would have just slid, you know, to the wayside and never really been followed up on. But so decades later, with the help of Larry Yelland, you guys end up putting together, or he ends up putting together a case.
Yeah.
And, you know, Louis ends up getting arrested.
Right. He put this case together with his team of investigators. Great guys. You know, Bob Sane was a former Santa Ana detective, and Eddie Barakovitz was there, and they put together this case. The craziest thing we did was we needed to find out if we exhumed Linda's body a second time, would we find evidence that could lead to a criminal charge? And as it so happened, Dr. Michael Bodden, one of the great, most famous pathologists in the country, testified in the Kennedy assassination and against Phil Spector and other things like that. So he was giving a show in Las Vegas, a crazy thing, at the Rio Casino and Suites. And so he said, "You want to go out and talk to him?" So Larry Yon and I and Bob Romaine, a retired detective, go to Vegas, we get a meeting with Dr. Modden, and I run the evidence by him. This is what I got, and this is what happened. And he looks at it and says, you know, this is going to be a problem, this is going to be a problem, this is going to be a problem, but maybe if you can do the body, and that casket is in good shape, and it's not exposed to the elements in this, you have a 15% chance of finding usable DNA evidence. 15% chance, not great odds, but there's still a chance. And it's enough to help convince a judge to exhume Linda's body. And they did exhume Linda's body in 2004. I was there. Reporters usually don't get to go to exhumations, but because I have played an integral role in bringing this case to the bar, I was invited to go. Some detectives didn't want me there, but I was there. And you see the casket coming out of the ground slowly with this hoist, and you're hoping that there's caskets in good shape. The casket costs $98. I saw the receipt. $90 is coming up, and just they're starting to swing it over around like you hear this horrendous crack, and the casket caved in on itself. This cheap wooden casket didn't sustain, 30 years into the ground, and there's no DNA evidence to be found. I went to the autopsy. There's nothing quite like an experience going to an autopsy. Reporters are usually going to go there, but dead is dead, and you're looking at a victim, and you're hoping for, Joe, you're hoping for evidence to get justice for it. At the same time, oh my God, I ruined this woman's eternal rest by this quest I have for justice. I felt like I might be too selfish and over involved in this case. And they didn't find any evidence. It was really a low point in my investigation. But then Larry Yellen, without me involved anymore, he found an evidence that got a judge to sign an arrest warrant. And next thing I know, I said, if you're in Henderson on such and such a date, there might be somebody being arrested on your Linda Cummings case. So I was, reporters aren't there when people are arrested for murder, but I was there. And they pulled this guy out of his house. That ain't him. hey, Louis, I look at him, he says, oh, wait a minute. I look at him closely, and he looked at me, and I said, yeah, those are the eyes I remember. Because it changed radically from the time I first saw him to then.
Well, the way you kind of describe it in the book, I mean, he's now this overweight, unhealthy chain smoker that's living in I guess it's like a mobile home park or something?
No, and he lived in a nice spot. And
Okay.
He lived in a house on a golf course in Henderson. His ex-wife lived in a mobile home park, but he lived in a nice house in a retirement community in Henderson, Nevada.
It's interesting, though, because when you read the book, he ends up marrying a woman while he's getting in a relationship with a woman while he's in prison, who's supposedly super smart.
Yeah, it's a crazy story. And I found out later, we try, over the years, you kind of lose track of him. And then we want to find out, is he still alive, or where was he at? And we couldn't find him anywhere after he'd served his time for killing Mrs. Morgan. And finally, our computer expert found him, I think, through his social security number. But he changed his name after he got out of prison for criminal. Why would somebody change his name? And later on, we found out he changed his name because he didn't want his past to catch up to him. But he married this woman in prison. And she was a member of this group called Mensa. You've heard of Mensa? The smarty pants people. And you have to be in the top 2% of the IQ of the country to be a member of Mensa, to be eligible for member of Mensa. So she and her fellow Mensans in the Bay Area would go to San Quentin prison, to cheer up the fellas, is what she told me. And they had this club at San Quentin, she says, it's called the Mensa Club, that they were supposed to they're supposed to have tested inmates in the prison, and Louis tested the top 2%, so he's qualified for member of Mensa.
It makes him Quensa.
Yeah, I got to call bullshit on that because I don't think San Quentin tests inmate for IQ just for the fun of it. So I have my doubts that he was actually fully tested, but he maintained that lie for the rest of his life.
Yeah, this is the guy who had all the misspellings in his ransom note for the FBI.
Right.
Yeah, but so he's leading this sedate life, in Henderson, Nevada, and suddenly the police show up, and
A knock on the door, yeah, I call it a knock on the door.
a knock on the door. That's your past catching up with you, Louis. And the next thing you know, the case gets taken to court, but it doesn't go to trial right away. And they kind of, at the advice of his defense attorney, they kind of just let it ride out.
Yeah, it kind of ripens in court
Well,
for 4 years.
I mean, I can see that from the sense that you're hoping that memories fall short, witnesses pass away. The longer you can stretch this out, the less likelihood there is to get everything together to make a good, case. But you're reading this book, and as you're reading it, you're going, okay, this guy's going to finally get his due. The justice is finally going to be served, and it doesn't quite happen that way.
Right, it didn't quite happen that way. Can I backtrack just a little bit to the arrest, the day of the arrest?
Sure.
Because it has a piece of fantastic police work that I think might be interesting. I'm in a car with the radio listening to the things going down around me, and there's like detectives, cars, plane are all in the neighborhood waiting for this. They send in 2 detectives to knock on the door first. Eddie Barakovich, who used to be a Orange County sheriff, now he's working for the DA's office, and Dean Fulcher, who was the Santa Ana police detective. And they go in there and knock on the door and said, we want to talk to Louis about what happened in 1974, and we have some questions for you. Would you like to talk to us? Because they're hoping to get him to admit that he had, see if he wants to confess or cop out. Fantastic interview, just a textbook case of how you should interview somebody in a situation like that. They want him to admit to having a sexual relationship with Linda because he said, there's this thing called DNA out there, and we're here for a reason, and the reason is that why is your DNA found on this person? Which they didn't have any DNA, but they want to see what he says. And for the first time in life as well, we kind of fooled around a little bit back then. Maybe that explains it. So he admits to having sex with Linda, and it's a bluff that the detectives ran on him. And I thought that was really a critical piece of evidence because Linda was never dated, was not one to engage in any kind of casual sexual encounter, and the idea that she would have sex with a married man on the first day in an apartment is just beyond belief. Fantastic work. So, after the arrest, I'm interviewing his wife, the Mensa person, in her front yard, and she invites me to the house. And after this nice interview, she tells me things like, "I hope they take into consideration the man Louis became when they, decide what to do with him, because he's a wonderful man, a wonderful husband, and a great guy." And she asked me, "Who's the best lawyer in Orange County? Because I want to hire him to represent my husband." And I didn't feel comfortable giving her one name, so I gave her 6 names. I gave her Paul Meyer, Ron Brower, Jack Early, Jennifer Keller, Al Stockey, and John Barnett. 6 great lawyers, and she hires John Barnett. Probably the best lawyer in this century in Orange County. Well, how lucky can one guy get when he's represented by Ron Butler in 1974, the best lawyer of his day, and John Barnett in 2005. The best lawyer of this century. John files a motion to dismiss for lack of speedy prosecution because this case is not in court for any scientific discovery, for any prosecutorial zeal, for any scientific advancement. The only reason this case is in court is because of Larry Welborn of the Register wanted to write a human interest story about the poor fate of this poor girl, a mixed-up girl who committed suicide. So he blames me in one part of his motion to dismiss for causing his client to be arrested. And it did have an impact on my story because I was taken off the story for my editors thought it was a conflict of interest.
Well, I think there is a lot of truth to the fact that this case would have never gone anywhere if you hadn't been diligent in your pursuit of it over time.
That's probably true, yeah. It would have died before anybody heard about it. It would have been no story. Newspapers don't cover suicides. They don't report on suicide unless it's in a public place that causes like a huge traffic jam or it's a celebrity. And so we would never put her name in the paper at all.
So Judge Fassel, who's the judge in this case, hearing these motions, looks at all the evidence and he makes a decision.
Right. In 2009 is decision day, and he prepares this very well thought out decision. I never mentioned my name as a causational effect of this case, but witnesses died and memories faded, and this newly discovered evidence of the strangulation by this professor from Indiana named Dr. James Starrs could have been found in 1974. Therefore, there was no reason to delay the trial for 31 years, and all that was detrimental to the rights of the defendant, Louis Whitecheckie, or David Stanley, as his other name. And therefore, he dismissed all charges with prejudice, and Louis was free to go. And it was, without a doubt, the lowest point of my journalism career. I thought that I'd let it down, and it wasn't, I didn't get the resolution that I had hoped for.
But the story doesn't quite end there. There's a little piece of justice still to be delivered.
Well, I thought it ended there. 4 years later, I was covering the Kelly Thomas case, and I was suddenly retired by an economic downturn in the newspaper business, I guess. And so I thought that for sure, without being me on the staff of the Register, that Linda's story died with me when I left the Register. But I went on to what I call the 2 G's of retirement: grandchildren and golf. And so I was minding my own business, golfing and playing with my grandkids, when I get a call, or actually it was an instant message from a reader in Central California who had found my stories back when Louis was arrested. And she said that the governor of the state of California had a press conference with all these detectives in the state, a big giant press conference on TV, announcing a big reward for this mystery killer known as the Golden State Killer. He'd killed people in the Bay Area and near Sacramento, and in Santa Barbara and in Orange County, and he'd been connected through DNA to dozens of cases around the state. All of these agencies saved the biological material to file murder charges and rape charges around the state. I mean, dozens of cases. It made me wonder, why didn't Orange County save that piece of evidence? And because the killer had manipulated the scene, and that was really unfortunate. But she said, this reader said, didn't that picture that they had a drawing on the press conference of a young man in the long hair, and doesn't that look like Louis? Could that be Louis? Could he be the Golden State Killer? I said, yeah, maybe it is. Maybe it is. So I looked at it, and I did a little bit of investigation. I had to go down and get at my information out of the attic, and I found the time frame that Louis was in prison that says the DNA of some of these cases connected him to somebody else that wasn't Louis. He was therefore he was not the Golden State Killer. So I was going to call the reader back and say that. I didn't anticipate renewing the story, but then she calls back and says, or message back and says, never mind, Louis dead. He died the week before. Incredible timing. About the same time I had the press conference for the Golden State Killer. And my thought was, oh really, Louis is dead. That's interesting, and I wanted to check it out. So I called those neighbors I interviewed in 2004 or 2005 when he was arrested. I saved their phone numbers, and I called this woman back and said, is it true that Louis died? She said, oh yeah, he died. In a nice ceremony, all the neighbors came, and he was widely respected. We had a real nice ceremony, and of course you read his book, didn't you? No, I didn't read his book. I didn't know he wrote a book. What book are you talking about? It turns out that Louis Whitesnake, the guy who was a suspect in the murder of Linda Cummings and who was convicted of the death of Mrs. Morgan, had written a book called Through the Eyes of a Criminal, in which he was a master criminal who'd committed murders for hire to raise money to fund a vendetta against the people who did him wrong by linking up to this suicide and charging him with murder 31 years after the fact. And so he wanted to inflict some kind of punishment on those folks that did him wrong, among which was a LA area journalist who did end up getting murdered in his book. That was me. I'm sure he's imagining my demise as vendetta in his book, Through the Eyes of a Criminal. So I wasn't going to let him get the last word. So I started looking back at the case and seeing is there something else further we could do with the book, with the story, to tell a better story. I didn't anticipate what it might be, but then I kept coming back to the death certificate, which now says not suicide, but undetermined. They crossed out suicide and put undetermined in there.
And that was a process, too. It didn't just happen overnight.
Right, there was a process, right. And so I called up Linda's half-brother, Paul Broadway, down in San Diego. I said, Paul, doesn't this bother you that the death certificate says undetermined? Hell yeah, it does. I said, you want to do something about it? And he says, hell yeah, I do. And through that effort, we found Mike Fell, who was another one of my heroes, who is a former prosecutor, who's now a defense attorney. He doesn't take up any cases involving violence. And he takes a lot of cases. He's probably the state's foremost expert in victims' rights laws, Marcy's Law. And I said, here's the victim here. Do you want to help Paul out, get some kind of, final good answer for your sister, for his sister? He says, yeah, I'll do anything I can. So Mike Fell got on the case, and through Mike Fell, we filed this petition with the county to change Linda's death certificate from undetermined to homicide.
And the family was greatly appreciative.
Yes, I think the family said that next weekend we met at Linda's gravesite. There was Paul Bauer was there with his wife Marcia, Annie and I were there, and Larry Allen was there, Ed Brack was there, Bob Sane was there, and Bob Romaine was there. And as COVID, so we all had to stand 5 feet apart. But Paul went to each one of us and thanked us for their efforts to try to get some justice for my sister. He said, this means more to our family than a conviction would have meant, because Linda was a Catholic, and she believed that suicide would be a mortal sin. And therefore, she is no longer, her story is no longer her legacy. It belongs to the murder label is attached to the killer, not a legacy of her being a suicide victim. So it's quite rewarding to have that day and he was so eloquent. I think you could read it in the book about his emotions at the time when we met.
Well, Larry, it's a great read. I highly suggest people, if you like true crime stories, or it's just a sense of this, like I've said before, this tenacious quest for justice for a victim who had no voice in the outcome. But we hope to have you back again. You have more stories in your hip pocket than most people have in a lifetime of working, with all your experiences in the court. And we look forward to having you here again on Behind the Badge. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you very much for having me here. I appreciate it, and hope everybody reads the book and gets some kind of warm feeling about it.
Okay, thank you.
5-star review.
Thank you.
I agree.
Thank you, gentlemen.